And there's two different tables for the 40% and 60% run, because when you're meeting those 60% standards, you have to use storage more aggressively because you're using more water for the deliveries. So the numbers are lower in that table. And so this is just an example of how those storage targets get computed. So storage in September is 1,010,000 acre feet. You move to February, it's about 1,216, so it's almost the same. Inflow is 441,000 acre feet in March through September. So take that and apply that to that table. And these numbers are interpolated, so 441 falls between 200 and 700. You end up with a proportion of 0.69. And multiply that by, so 1210 is the storage in September. You remove the 80 TIF, which is the minimum storage. Multiply that difference by that proportion and get 776. Then add the 80 back on, and that's your end of September storage target. And then that leaves you with 360 TIF of storage that you can use for deliveries in that year. And then that's, the target was 856. The model actually got to 860. That's pretty good. It doesn't always do that well. There's certainly uncertainty in the releases that are necessary, so it doesn't always hit those targets quite so well. And I'm just going to finish up here and show some slides with some graphs of some of the results of the four scenarios. So the lines are New Melones storage. The bars at the bottom, the blue bars, are the total deliveries of Oakdale, South San Joaquin, and the CVP contractors. And that black line is New Melones minimum power pool, which is 300 TAF. So D1641 VAMP study deliveries were 585,000 acre feet. If you move to the 20% scenario, it's 591. So the 20% is pretty similar to the D1641 VAMP in terms of the allocation for releases. But if you move to 40%, then the deliveries start to go down, 529 TAF. And then at 60%, you start to get a real drastic difference, 456. And you can also see the storages in New Melones are drastically lower in this scenario. And I think that the earlier comments about using calcium comparatively are definitely appropriate here. Probably the best use of these numbers is to take the differences between that first study and then these next three studies in order to look at how things change.
Tom, would you feel comfortable trying to explain to me the difference between storage volume and net yield? You know, I've heard people talk about increasing Shasta Dam, if you will, and it's easy to calculate the additional volume, but what I'm being told is, and it's just one example, that the actual yield isn't equivalent to the volume.
You want me to take that one?
And let Mary address that one. Go ahead, or you have your.
Oh.
I talk in code, so maybe Mary's getting used to it.
Yes, so yield is generally the, or at least traditionally it was defined as the ability to, the amount of water that you could deliver between when the reservoir was completely full and the end of the dry period, assuming, you know, some shortage criteria during the drier years. The reason why it doesn't work quite as well anymore is that, for instance, in Large Shasta is one of the studies in our planning division, if you, the 18.5-foot increase would increase storage on the order of 634,000 acre feet, but you know the actual deliveries that might be increased are like under 100,000 acre feet, right, Tom? Tom ran the studies, and the reason for that is that, well, part of it is because we're one of the objective functions of increasing Shasta storage is to be able to enhance the anadromous fishery conditions, so we can better manage the temperature in the Sacramento River below Shasta. But the other reason is
But Mary, let me stop you there, and you're doing
Yeah.
a good job of answering my question, and I really appreciate it. But if a portion of that 600,000 acre feet was used to enhance the cold water portion of the fishery, wouldn't that water also have a dual purpose of being available for delivery after it had passed Ball's Ferry?
Oh, it certainly would, but see, that's where the difficulty comes in because as you know, there's many, both state and federal constraints for delivering water across the delta, and so the temperature enhancement might occur at a time when we can't then export that water, because most of our demand, or unmet demand, is south of the delta, and that's really in a nutshell why the actual water delivery yield is fairly low.
I appreciate your explanation. Thank you very much.
And that's actually my last slide. I'm going to turn it back over to Mary here to talk about the implications.
Eric would have said that's what he was going to say.
So, this table here summarizes, just in terms of end of September storage and water delivery impacts of moving from, the current standard, which is D1641, as implemented through VAMP, to the 20, 40, and 60% bypass standards. And this is what you get out of calcium, which is a good result, certainly very usable in a comparative sense. But if you look at the 60% bypass, you'll see that there's a 25% reduction in total water delivery, 50% reduction in storage, and it's that 50% reduction in storage that where just using calcium doesn't tell the whole story, because 50% reduction in storage is going to have a very significant impact on temperature, which is going to have a very significant impact on fisheries, and then it's also going to have a significant impact on power and recreation. In addition, if we depending on how a standard like this were implemented, if it was strictly a, say, 60% bypass of unimpaired inflow in real time, that would be a very difficult thing to do, to operate to. I think Eric explained that very well in his slides on unimpaired flow and, the difficulty of estimating unimpaired flow in real time. The other issue is that this slide, or just one set of studies can't tell you what you could do instead of, say, drawing down storage. I mean, certainly you could reduce water supply impacts more and keep storage up, but you'd have to do another set of studies to figure that one out. So what I guess kind of our bottom line here is to encourage the State Water Resources Control Board to use, the entire suite of tools, that we've talked about in the workshop so far, and that we'll be talking about in the rest of the workshop, so that to get a full assessment of the impacts. And what we would like to see, from reclamation standpoint, the Central Valley Project was authorized by Congress for 7 purposes, and we need to, in order to repay those purposes, we would like to see standards that balance all beneficial use, including environmental flows, water supply, power, temperature needs, and recreation. We'd also like to have standards that allow for sustainable operation in this case study for New Maloney's, but for all of our reservoirs, and that flow requirements be commensurate with the impacts that are caused by the water supply deliveries. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Ron and Paul to talk about operational considerations.
If I might ask a question before Ron begins, perhaps he can answer the question too. And if this question is too complicated and will take too much time, I'm sure Brock will advise us. I want to explore a little bit more this issue of unimpaired flow in real time and the operational challenges that it it raises, because that's an area that I'm very concerned about too. So, and I'll ask this at both federal and state water projects. If you had to meet an unimpaired flow requirement, how would you go about doing it, and what are some of the difficulties that you would have? And how might those difficulties be overcome?
Well,
Can I add on to that, Mary?
Yeah.
I mean, we have certainly heard the proposal of unimpaired flows, and we've heard people that like it, we've heard people that don't like it. If I sit here and ask you and Tara, if you don't like this idea, what's your better idea? I know Michael Jackson's going to be about 8 feet tall and belch flame, but you know, you do have the operation, as I mentioned earlier, you have the operational obligations, if you will, for both the state and federal projects. So if there is a better metric or mechanism, and I think this is maybe what Tam is getting at and what Stephen was acknowledging, if there's a better metric or method that accomplishes the goals that we've stated here, I, for one, certainly am not locked into any particular metric. I want to get to the end of the finish line and accomplish our environmental goals. And, you know, I realize somebody's going to say, well, you're asking the fox how big a door they should have in the hen house. I think you're all smart enough to realize that that ploy wouldn't work. But if you have a better idea operationally, certainly this is the time to articulate, or not this moment, but it's the opportunity, I think, to articulate that mechanism jointly between the state and federal. So I hope I didn't say something you weren't saying.
Well, certainly a set hydrograph. So I think Ron's slides will point out that, you know, at the beginning of the season, you have about this much uncertainty in terms of what your flows are going to be. So, and as you go into the operational season, that uncertainty diminishes. So if at, you know, at some set time, maybe February or March, you know, when you're already into the operating season, if you could pick a time and a certain exceedance forecast, you know, that provides more certainty. But I'm going to turn over to Ron to see if you have any other ideas in terms of metrics.
Well, I was going to say it's too complicated, but maybe that's not.
If it's too complicated for you when you operate the system, how the hell complicated do you think it is for us sitting here not knowing how you do it?
I can empathize with that. I think the question on the unimpaired, just as something to think about, is on what time step are we contemplating that? If it's on a daily, let's say percent of unimpaired on a daily mechanism, it's difficult because you don't have necessarily all the data to tell you, well, what should it be other than maybe your reservoir inflows, and you're trying to deal with it that way. But you're not quite even sure how the basin below the rim reservoirs is kind of responding also. And I think that we'll, my understanding is looking at some of the submittals that tomorrow you might have some more discussion about that very large area in the Sac River Basin that's really below Shasta, below Oroville, below Folsom, that has a tremendous response to it if the basin is wet, but can be an incredible depletion of flows when the basin is, you know, kicking on in a dry scenario and you have irrigation starting. And at what point do you want to measure the unimpaired aspect? Do you want this at the delta, yet who are you putting that responsibility on? And it's very difficult. Maybe one thing to say to the state and federal projects, you have some obligation if you construct it that way, but you have a lot of diverters between the main reservoirs and downstream when you get to, let's say, Freeport in the Sacramento, that has an element of that. And if they're kind of depleting the basin in a way, that makes that a little harder if you get to some of these higher numbers. So.
Ron, how do you factor in through flow in that calculation? I mean, it's reasonably easy to calculate diversion, but the return into the system from through flow is something that, you know, I've got a landowners, which I'm not, unfortunately, from bulletin from District 108 measuring outfalls in individual fields, which, quite frankly, I think is the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. But we go through $1 million for one district here, but there's no measurement that I see from the return flows, which have got to be a functional part of the whole system. How do you calculate those return flows and through flows?
Well, on a real-time basis, it's almost too difficult to manage it. It's one of the forest for the trees. You're almost better off looking at responses at some of the critical locations like Wilkins Slough, Gage, what you see at Verona and at Freeport, to get a feel for, is the basin depleting, or are you starting to see accretions back in, whether they're from the fields for irrigation or are the creeks starting to run? You know, right now is a really interesting time of the year where you see what's the response of the basin right now in terms of a couple of early storms that are just kind of wetting up the soil, and you don't see a lot of response. We still see considerable amount of depletion in the Sac Valley. Things like water being diverted for rice decomp is still somewhat in a swing. So, but if in a week from now we start to see some significant rainfall, I think you'll see the basin start to kick into a actual accretions point of view, and you'll see that at the various gauges down as you go downstream. So it's kind of like you set a point, monitor it, and then respond to that in the next few days and kind of manage that as you go. And I think that the standards for outflow right now, the way we have it set up in D1641, is probably a reasonable place for the projects to be able to deal with that outflow requirement within its scheduling necessities for pumping in response to what we see coming out of the basin.
So part of that obligation for outflow isn't necessarily a result of release, but through other contributions possibly. Is that correct?
Well, that's certainly a parameter. I mean, a schematic that just kind of shows the reservoirs with some arcs down to the delta is a bit limiting, oversimplification of what's going on. When you have such a large area that's unregulated in terms of its storm response potentially, but with a lot of diversions and returns back to the river. So the projects are potentially driving a lot of what that outflow is, but some of the fine-tuning of that really depends on a weekly basis almost what's going on within the basin. And if you get if a storm doesn't come through next week, you'll kind of see things just, continually not, the projects are going to try to get to a point where we're trying to cut back on some of our releases to benefit some fishery concerns, put us in to make sure we're hedging our bets properly going into the next year in terms of carryover storage. And if things turn dry, it's really important in the fall to see some weather come through to be able to work that into the portfolio, so to speak, of the whole water management aspect. So getting back to the original question of unimpaired flow, again, over what kind of time frame would you want to see that? Is that in the course of a day, a week, over a month, or let's say a season perhaps? And, as we go through some of the slides here, I think we could talk about that. I'll loop back to that one question because when you get into the winter, that's an interesting dynamic. And to do this, you may need to actually forego some storage of water that traditionally we've used and help manage the system. So there may be some other, see if I can get the right button here.
Yep, I would note that you mentioned time step, but you also mentioned where do you measure it?
Also, where would one want to measure that? A couple things from an operational standpoint. This first slide is probably more observational. in the sense that you're seeing a lot of different models being discussed. And I think that's just indicative of the various beneficial uses that you see in the basin, whether it's a salmon life cycle model or calcium with water supplies or some of the water quality outflow concerns. You see a lot of different models. That's just a lot of different benefits. And how you mesh those together is going to be important. And then operationally, those are the things that we intuitively have to deal with. The second thing that we are dealing with in an operational sense is we're really trying to, because of all these different beneficiaries, trying to get maximum multiple uses out of a particular unit of water. So if we have an acre foot of water, you know, that has a recreational benefit potentially, depending on when you take it out of the reservoir. Certainly generate power with that, can contribute to cold water pool or in-stream flows. Can be used for deliveries or outflows to improve water quality. So the timing of where acre feet of water kind of move through the system can serve multiple uses, and it's really not just a pie chart that we're just going to carve up in a different way. And that's an important element that we need to think through as we go through this. I think that there is always going to be competing needs for the water, regardless of how well thought through a particular standard set of criteria may be. I think that we need to keep some kind of element of adaptive management involved in that, because you're going to see competing needs. There are going to be times where use of water in a particular way may have an effect on another use. And depending on what the circumstances are at that time, whether it's socioeconomic, status of the species, because the ocean conditions weren't particularly good for a period of time for salmon, let's say, those things need to be taken into consideration when we get into more of an annual or seasonal perspective. And do you need to heavy up your objective in one area because you've got a critical nature there? And I think that we just need to be conscious of the idea that we're going to have to manage this in a way for a time until we see some response back on the species. This is a chart that I asked our folks to put in for a couple of reasons. One, because it's a lot more colorful than a lot of what that we use. But this is a diagram of, through time, of the cold water pool at Folsom. But it could be reminiscent of what we might see at Shasta or New Melones potentially. And what it does kind of show here is this y-axis being storage, time on the x-axis, and the colors are the temperatures. But typically, building in the spring a volume of water, a lot of that is fairly cold water at the time. This is in anticipation of trying to manage a cold water pool for, in the case of the Lower American River. But there's a time where we get to the spring where that lake starts to stratify, and then the upper layers of that reservoir are temperatures that are not going to be very conducive to the downstream fishery. So through the use of a temperature control device and the ability to selectively withdraw, that's what these various dashed arrows are, represent a elevation where we're selectively withdrawing at a particular time to tap into a particular temperature of water and then go down to a subsequent lower level to be able to get a cooler amount of water, blend that for a time, and then move on to the next step and the next step. And as you see, by the time we get to the end of the summer or early fall, we pretty well depleted the full cold water available. Now, this is important because if some of our management strategies in the winter, spring are such that we've moved water out of the system and did not store it, we end up with a lower starting point of this cold water come springtime. And although that may be evened out with, well, I guess we'll just take less water out of the reservoir, I think we'll have, this is just indications of the type of dynamic that will occur. We have less cold water ultimately to deal with to be able to meet a cold water pool objective or downstream temperature compliance point. But this is an interest, unless we've talked about it quite a bit in some of the workshops, but this is hopefully an informative diagram as to just how that looks. And this gets significantly squeezed by the time you get to the fall, even though in October, in this particular point of view, you had almost the same amount of water as you had earlier in the winter, but certainly a much different temperature component. Another diagram, and Mary kind of alluded to this, is, and this comes into play in terms of the unimpaired strategy, is that as we go through the winter, our understanding of, what's the overall amount of runoff we might see from the Sac River Basin has a lot of uncertainty associated with it in the December-January timeframe. And what you might have thought about in this previous year, starting off at a particular point, may have been a different strategy that you may have had by the time you got to February, where you saw the runoff probably going down quite a bit. By the time you got to March, from an operational standpoint, you're thinking, this is a pretty dire water year, potentially. We should be taking actions to limit our reservoir releases and try to conserve as much of the storage as we can. And then things started to get a little bit wetter in mid-March, and you kind of recovered back up to a point in May, but you didn't quite get to where you thought you could be in December. So this is not only indicative that the uncertainty is kind of narrow, but it's a bit of a wild ride going from, gee, it's dry to it looks like it could be really, really dry, almost a super critically dry year, to something you could kind of manage. And the timing that the water comes into the reservoir is kind of critical. It's, we talk about different water year types, but it's always not a smooth ride along a line, because we go from one month to the next thinking, is it dry, just below normal, critically dry, back to above normal. And this is indicative of the perfect foresight concern with some of the models. CalSim in some of its elements doesn't capture this. And so some of our decisions that say, well, gee, didn't you know where you'd be in May of a particular year? Well, the answer is no, I was all over the place. So what we may have, and what we were thinking at times, making contingency plans over the last year, at particular months of last winter, early spring, we're all over the map, and you crumble that piece of paper off and go to the next one. How do we deal with that?
But isn't some of that just blind luck? When I looked at the extraordinary storage in Shasta last fall, I thought either somebody is really smart or we're sitting on the end of a skyrocket here. And come March, I was thinking, boy, whoever left that extra water in Shasta, it had to be Paul Fujitani, and he's the smartest guy I know. But I mean, part of that's just luck, isn't it?
Part of it is knowing what you think is the most likely. I mean, certainly depends on how risk adverse you want to be. You can go a long time and say, I'm going to keep water in the reservoir and end up, quote, spilling it and not be able to put it to as many beneficial uses as you can. And you go along that way and say, okay, this is the right management place to be. And then you get a sequence of some pretty dry years or some very dry falls potentially, or a sequence of dry springs, and then you say, gee, we should be keeping more water in. And that
So my analogy of luck, that's not right.
Well, we're talking about the weather, and so there's a lot of luck associated with it. And so good planning, you just need to kind of have your plans, but don't get too stuck on them, and so you can go on to the next piece.
Good job, Paul.
So Paul, but I'll go to the last bullet I have here with that. You need folks like Paul and our operations staffs at both the state and federal projects, because it's really complicated and there's a lot of variability. And you need to anticipate potentially what could happen. So there's a lot of experience that goes into that. Whether you're on towards the flood side of this or the drought side of this, or flow fluctuations are another concern. You know, that's not the best thing for the fishery at times, or for the river flood control dynamics either. So probably the experience aspect of this is really critical. So we can't take that out of a set of whatever proposal it is. We need to have some element where we can respond. But kind of working through this, there's seasonal planning, and then there's the real-time respond to what you see. And a lot of that can be because we are dealing with the weather. And whether that's in the wintertime, and what we're trying to describe in terms of how do you deal with the basin, let's say the Sac Basin and the unimpaired aspects of that. If we have a weather forecast saying, well, gee, we might get an inch of rain on that basin a week from now, and you're dealing with a 5-day lead time, let's say, for Shasta releases, to what degree do you bank on that? And to be able to factor that in. So you're watching those weather forecasts very closely, but the availability of that forecast and how confident we are in it can really change how you might have to operate without potentially moving pumping around in a way that's probably not efficient, both from a mechanical standpoint and for a beneficial use for water supply. You know, we have to be sure that availability of data. We're kind of going a lot on availability of gauged information, but gauges go out and can be vandalized, knocked out because of winds, power, you name it. So there's elements there that we've got to be realistic about the availability of the data that we're going to rely on. And old and middle river flows, for an example. Lots of analysis being done on that information kind of after the fact. But old and middle river flow gauges have their challenges at times for the projects to use them in a real-time operational sense, because that data has some massaging that goes along with it before it gets to us. And if you have missing data and that has to come into play, that can be difficult. So that's just an example there. Then the scheduling considerations, whether it's Cal ISO power scheduling constraints or just the travel time for project water to get from, whether it's Shasta, Folsom, Oroville, all of that comes into play. And that needs to be thought through, particularly if we're talking about an unimpaired flow component that can move around, and how do we calculate that? And again, where's the compliance point? And over what period of time are we averaging that or thinking that through? So a couple things about the models back to the operations. A couple things to think about. One is the time step. CalSim, which is driving a lot of this, is a great quote planning tool. Think about scenarios. CalLight in a real lightning fast way to go about things. But we are dealing with a monthly time step there, and an element of perfect foresight that we need to take into consideration. It may kind of tell you what's the realm of possibility, but then you've got to add another consideration on, can I really implement this in a real-time sense? Adding to that, the forecasting capabilities that come into play from a real-time aspect of this too. The models, particularly CalSim, have some other institutional things built into them, and one needs to think through COA may be an example of that. Certain representation of COA is in CalSim. Is that still the same representation or interpretation of COA that may exist depending on how a new set of standards may be layered in? Or there's other standards from D1641, should they be preserved as they are or modified if they're in conjunction with some other new elements? And I think Eric kind of hit on this, but something like CalSim, 82 years of hydrologic record data in there, that's the good news. It's the past. And is that still going to hold for us as we move forward? So we need to understand that that's in there. And I think sensitivity analyses on some potential with climate change that may occur with that also probably needs to temper some decision. So there the models come with their own sets of assumptions that need to be kind of proofed out before you hang your hat on there too much. So with all of that, I think that we can't take the operators kind of out of this. I think we need to, particularly if it's a new kind of paradigm that we're talking about, we're going to need some opportunity for the projects to work with whatever the mechanism that we'll have to be able to see what the unintended consequences may be as we move through this. Because one thing is going to then ripple into another, I'm pretty sure. And we'll need to respond to that, and we'll need to have a mechanism to deal with some new changing regimes.
We heard about Paradise Island, and I actually am going to ask all of you the idea of folks sitting down, and these were the scientists and operators and whatever, sitting down and working out some more options than any individual agency might have come up with. Do you see potential for that kind of effort on on the projects? Let's just start there. But I'm hearing what you say, and I know you talk to each other because the systems do come together. But how much engagement is there with others, and do you have the opportunity to really explore what some of the questions that Charlie was asking of, are there some other things we should be taking advantage of that we have that we just haven't thought of, or that we are somehow restricted from, but that could change? That's a legal or a policy decision.
Well, I think when you look at phase 1 of the Bay Delta Plan update, we do have a collaboration coming together in the San Joaquin River, the San Joaquin River settlement process. So it is an example of the reservoir operators coming together with fishery agencies, the NGOs. I mean, we don't have a proposal to present to you yet, but hopefully it'll be successful, and we do have modeling to help inform that effort too.
I think I would add that the more that we can find a forum to have the discussion about, because I think there's some, the more we talk about what the dynamics are and how things do link together, I think that only helps the process. I think that there's potentially misconceptions all the way around. There's, operators are probably looked at as, gee, they're just focusing on one thing, but I can say my staff and the things that we deal with Department of Water Resources and operating the project, we are thinking about a lot of things that are well beyond just some power scheduling and some pumping regimes. I think, obviously that's a big focus of what we do, but it's also trying to do that in a way that is sensitive to various fishery concerns. And sometimes we get a proposal that's maybe fairly narrowly focused on, let's try something for the fishery or something habitat-wise that in itself may not seem like such a bad idea, but it may have other implications to some of the same species, but just at a different life stage potentially. So I think that the times where we've taken the opportunity to really talk through the interrelated dynamics of and just really express how complicated this all is linked together, I think that does help, and we get much more robust proposals. And I think that the ability to build upon the beneficial use of a single unit of water becomes more realistic. But it does take time, and so in a world of do more with less, I mean, we need to be real smart about how we do that. But folks, there's always room for good proposals to come to the table and have a good, robust discussion about this. But I think in terms of what the Fish and Wildlife Service was discussing before, what is the ultimate objective? You can't get too narrow with that and jump to that too soon, or you do kind of foreclose some options. And there may be times that if the project operators knew about something, opportunistically we could probably deal with that, because we do have the full array of hydrology that we're dealing with. And you know, if you got some time to wait, you know, a good idea's time may come and be an opportunity, as long as you're able to mobilize at the right time with resources or data collection or what may. And those are the things where I think the dialogue is really important. Good planning.
I was just going to add more on the biological and some of the delta modeling areas. I think the panel brought up some in terms of modeling and trying to be more, you know, talking more together and within groups. There's a lot going on, and even today, I mean, I thought today and tomorrow is going to be helpful because I'll be able to see things that are going on that perhaps that we can plug into more on an informal basis. I do know that the department and NIMS and the Bureau are planning future monitoring for 2014, and there's several agencies that are a part of that, and the modelers are involved in different aspects. But that's one area. And then I noticed today there were a couple other areas that I wasn't plugged into, and trying to be plugged into a lot of things going on is difficult, but it is important, whether it not be workshops where you can just do it informally or something more formal would be good. I'll plug QIMF again, the modeling forum. There's always been an attempt for the modeling forum to interact with the interagency program, and that continues, both groups working together, and I think that's a good aspect too. That's a good area to look into, or at least the exchange of information. So.
One thing that is completely clear to me is that looking at the clock and considering that I took a half hour off everybody's lunch, I'm one poor moderator because we're about an hour and a half behind schedule. Mr. Rubin has agreed to go tomorrow, which kind of reminds me of being in school and not having my term paper ready and having the teacher be sick. I know I'm still going to have to deal with it, but we will forego the break today for all of those that are looking forward to a 15-minute break, and we are going to put the San Joaquin Valley folks first thing tomorrow morning. Are you saying yes, John? You acknowledge that I'm being kind to you? No way, O'Loughlin. All right. All right. The benevolent Tim O'Loughlin has spoken again.
I'm sure he'll extract something in return, though.
I want you to figure out how much I owe this guy, Brock. I don't know if this is going to be tenable or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to return a quick phone call. I'll be right back.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. But Charlie will be back in just a few minutes, but let's go. Let's not wait. And so I'm not sure who's in charge, but I look at 5 capable people that are able to be in charge.
So my name is John Kane with American Rivers, and we're going to go in a little bit different order than stated. So we're going to start with myself, and then hear from the Nature Conservancy, and then from the Cal Sport Fishing Alliance and California Water Impact Network, and then we'll close with presentation by the Bay Institute NRDC. So I have 2 PowerPoint presentations, and so at a certain point in the presentation, I'm going to ask you to switch into the other file here. And if someone who has the mouse could pass it down here, great. Let's see. Can I get a clue here? Yeah, it doesn't want to roll now. There we go. So I'm going to talk about 3 different analytical tools and approaches. One is a couple of analytical tools for adaptive management. Then I'm going to talk quickly about some floodplain restoration analysis and tools that American Rivers has been working on and in the lower San Joaquin River in the Delta. And then a little bit about how the board might approach reservoir reoperation analysis. So you've seen this picture of the adaptive management diagram from the Delta Science Plan, and I just want to reiterate here that adaptive management is a cyclical process, and as you develop the implementation plan, it ends up being a do loop, and there's no way to avoid it. You have to do, study, change, and continually be reevaluating. And need to do it in a strategic.
At the break, I'll just, Charlie, if Charlie were here, he would probably be doing exactly this. Someone said you're in an infinite interim management approach. You're constantly in the interim. You're never to the end.
Well, I guess I can agree with that. I'm going to try to move through quickly because we have a big panel here and I don't want to take a lot of time. And I probably will take more time than you would like on this thing called the logic chain. Let me just say it was developed for the BDCP process and it's been reviewed by the Delta Science Program. We've done a lot of vetting of it, and it's really a structured decision-making process or format. There's also something called the Delta Regional Ecosystem Restoration Implementation Plan. They never call it that. They just call it DRERIP. And so these people that were having such a wonderful time, Bruce Herbold and John Durant, they were running through the DRERIP model, a DRERIP decision-making process. It's an excellent decision-making process. We hear a lot of talk about adaptive management. Here are some real tools to actually do it, and I hope you remember that adaptive management isn't just a vague term, but people have spent a lot of time figuring out how you would actually do it in our own system, and it's been vetted by our own Delta Science Council. The logic chains, as I was saying, is the structured decision-making process. We heard about that from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service today a little bit. It's a logical process for linking objectives, conservation measures, or restoration actions, and performance metrics. The objectives are part of the logic chain, but you heard earlier today, you really need to develop objectives if you want modelers to help you. And if you have any hope or pretense of doing adaptive management, one of the first things you need to do is have objectives. And we very strongly believe that they need to be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant to the goal, and time-bound. They need to be SMART objectives. And if they're not measurable, you're never going to be able to determine whether you're actually making progress towards your objective. And a very important part of objectives is that they should express the desired outcome and should not be commingled with strategies for achieving the desired outcome. That just creates a lot of confusion. So if you could bring up this other presentation that actually identifies the logic chain. And I'm going to ask for permission, I'm going to ask for forgiveness in advance, because a lot of people's eyes will glaze over. So just muster any energy you have and focus you have, and it's really not that complicated. And it's similar to this structured decision-making process. So up at the top, we heard about problem statement. Not going to go into a lot of detail on that. Goals are just sort of general statements about what we're trying to do. And for the NOAA fisheries have something they call the attributes of viability. And so they have goals around abundance, goals around spatial distribution, goals around population stability, and goals around life history diversity. So for each of those goals, you need at least one objective, and you might even have more than one objective. And this example of the logic chain is for winter run. And I'm not going to go a lot into the objectives. We'll just come down here to what we call the BDCP objective. And this is not the actual BDCP objective. This is just some language that we're using here. So increase existing winter run population to a mean of X by X date. That's our objective. It doesn't say how we're going to do it. It just says that's what we want to do. And then we have these things called conceptual models. Don't let them confuse you. We have the DRERIP process developed conceptual models for most of the sensitive species, many habitats, ecosystem processes. They've been peer reviewed. They took years to develop. And they really tell us what's the state of the knowledge about how the system's working. And you could use these conceptual models, or you could use numeric models of the system to try to figure out what is the thing that prevents us from achieving this objective. What is the assumed stressor? So in the green here, these green bubbles are the assumed stressor. And for any given objective, there's going to be competing ideas about what the assumed stressor is. Believe it or not, some people think it's food supply, and other people think it's water, and other people think it's habitat, and there are many different competing ideas.
Could there be a fourth model there, John, that had something to do with the ocean, where they go when they leave our control? Yeah, like giving a kid a credit card and a car?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Your assumed stressor could be that we give the kids too many credit cards, or that you've given the water districts too many credit cards. So here we've laid out the different assumed stressors, and I'm only going to take one of them. Is the stressor being survival through the delta is limited, and so when you've talked, Chairman Hoppin, when you talked about interim objectives, here is a place where you can start talking about setting interim objectives. This is the long-term objective. We want so many fish by a certain date. The interim objective is, well, if we think that survival through the delta is a problem, what can